Lithuania and the rest of Europe have officially pulled the plug on Russian energy. On September 19th, Lithuania didn't just disconnect Kaliningrad, they ripped out every last power line, cutting Putin's western outpost off the grid. And we're not talking about flipping a switch. This was crews in hard hats, physically tearing down steel towers and coiling up cables that had carried electricity for decades. If this were a breakup, Lithuania didn't just block Russia's number, they burned the phone. But this wasn't just about voltage. It was about defiance and freedom. It was about showing the Kremlin that Europe no longer runs on Moscow's current. For the Baltic states, it marked a final snip in a long overdue severance from Soviet-era dependence. In this video, we'll break down how Europe made the cut and why Kaliningrad might be the first domino in Russia's unraveling. To understand how we got to this point, where Kaliningrad has gone dark, we have to understand how the whole move started. Simply put, the Baltic nations, made up of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, had grown tired of living under Moscow's control. For decades, they were part of a power grid called BREL, which included Belarus, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Built in the 1950s and the 60s during the Soviet Union, this grid was designed to keep the region dependent on Moscow. Russian power plants in places like Smolensk set the rhythm, maintaining a steady 50 Hz that kept the lights on from Tallinn to Kaliningrad. But that supply came with a catch. Moscow controlled the flow, and any disruption from Moscow could bring the whole system crashing down. A single decision from the Kremlin could plunge Baltic cities into darkness, leaving people without heat or power. For the Baltics, energy wasn't just about keeping the lights on. It was about who held the reins of their daily lives. And this fear of Russian control wasn't just a made-up thing. It came from the fact that Russia had a long history of using energy as a weapon to bend neighbors to its will. For example, in 2006, a dispute over gas prices left Ukraine without heat in the dead of winter. The Kremlin turned off natural gas supplies to Ukraine at a time when temperatures dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius. This resulted in families huddling in freezing apartments, factories shutting down, and hospitals scrambling to keep generators running. 3 years later, in 2009, Russia cut gas again, this time hitting Bulgaria and Romania. As expected, the hardship was so severe that people started improvising. They burned wood to stay warm, and small shops closed their doors. The message was broadcast crystal clear: defy Moscow and pay a price. And again, after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Gazprom halted gas to Poland and Bulgaria because they refused to pay in rubles. Poland lost half of its gas supply overnight, and Bulgarian towns faced blackouts for days. These weren't random events. They were part of a pattern where Russia used pipelines and power lines to send a signal: cross us, and your lights go out. That's why, for the Baltics, the stakes couldn't have been higher when it comes to energy security. Their winters are brutal, and a blackout in January could freeze water pipes, spoil food in stores, and stop pumps that deliver drinking water. Hospitals rely on steady electricity to keep crucial life-saving machines running. Even a single day without power could turn dangerous, especially in rural areas where backup systems are limited. The Baltics knew this risk all too well, having lived under Soviet rule for decades. That's why in recent times it has become such a major talking point among Baltic leaders. Lithuania's prime minister said in a statement earlier this year that staying tied to BREL was like handing Russia a loaded gun. She emphasized how breaking free wasn't just optional, it was a matter of survival. After all, every winter under such a system brought the same dreadful question: would Moscow pull the trigger? And so, finally, the Baltics decided they couldn't live with that threat any longer, and they had to come up with a solution. Their answer was to join Europe's INSO-E grid, a network that spans 34 countries and shares power across borders. It wasn't a quick fix. The Baltics joined the EU in 2004, but syncing with Europe's grid took years of planning. Engineers had to make sure their systems could match Europe's frequency, a precise 50 Hz that keeps everything stable. They ran tests to prove their grids could stand alone if needed. They built new equipment, fixed old power lines, and added new cables across land and sea. Altogether, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia spent more than 1.6 billion euros on these upgrades. Lithuania alone spent around 700 million euros. Part of that money went towards a big project called Harmony Link. It was first planned as an undersea cable to connect Lithuania and Poland, but now it will be built on land to save money. Estonia also made some improvements. It upgraded its EST2 link to Finland, which can carry up to 650 megawatts of electricity. These changes help the Baltic countries get ready to fully connect with Europe's power grid and to stop relying on Russia. All of that planning paid off on February 8th of this year. At 2:05 p.m., the Baltic grids synced with INSO-E. For more than a day before, they ran in isolation, a test to prove they could survive without Russia's grid. Then they connected to Europe's network, and power started flowing from Danish wind farms, French nuclear plants, and Spanish solar fields. For people in cities like Vilnius or Riga, it was a quiet but historic moment. They could finally breathe easier, knowing that Moscow no longer controlled their electricity. The EU grid offers a safety net. If one country faced a shortage, others could step in within seconds. It was like moving from a house ruled by fear to a neighborhood where everyone pitches in to help. A neighborhood that Russia wasn't a part of. And almost as if to confirm the wise decision, the benefits showed up fast. Firstly, electricity prices stabilized across the region. Latvia saw a 15% drop in costs, Estonia 12%, and Lithuania 10%. Latvia started exporting extra wind power to Sweden, earning 50 million euros in just 6 months. Lithuania doubled its electricity exports to Poland, strengthening ties with its neighbor. Estonia's solar panels produced 1.2 terawatt-hours in 2024, feeding clean energy into the European grid. New technology made a difference too. Batteries stored extra power for peak hours, like early evenings when demand spiked, adding to energy security. This simple action cut energy waste by 10%, saving money and keeping the system reliable. For businesses, cheaper and steadier power meant they could plan without worrying about sudden outages or price jumps. This was a huge win for the Baltics. I mean, think about it. This was a region of just 6 million people, standing up to Russia's 144 million and its 2 trillion euro economy. They didn't need tanks or jets to pull it off, though Lithuania's defense budget, at 2.75% of GDP, bought plenty of those too. Their victory was in cables and engineering, a quiet but powerful shift. It sent ripples beyond their borders. By accomplishing such a milestone, the Baltic states had quietly given others permission to do the same. And so, Finland synced its grid with Europe through Sweden in 2024, cutting its own ties to Russia. Poland strengthened its grid with new cables, making the region more connected. Ukraine, battered by Russian strikes that left 8 million without power in 2022, started importing 2 gigawatts from the EU. It aims to fully join by 2027, sharing that same goal with Moldova. Even Belarus, one of Russia's closest allies, hinted it might explore alternatives by 2027. A sign that Moscow's iron grip is slipping. Where we have the Baltic nations celebrating on one side, across the border in Kaliningrad, the picture is very different. Home to about 1 million people, the region has become an energy island after the cutoff. It now relies entirely on its own power plants. Looking at its numbers, you would think that they have the situation handled. The numbers show that Svetli gas station produces 450 megawatts, old coal units from the 1980s add 600 megawatts, and diesel generators produce 300 more. Together, that's 1.88 gigawatts, enough to cover summer peaks of 900 megawatts and winter highs of 1,200. But what the numbers don't tell you is that the entire system is highly fragile. Its coal plants are outdated, the gas pipeline is a single point of failure, and diesel generators are expensive and unreliable. Basically, the numbers are a pipe dream. As if to show the vulnerability of the system, in June of this year, a substation, sabotaged by Ukrainian intelligence, cut power to military sites. That incident showed just how easily things could go wrong. Those vulnerabilities are turning up legal and diplomatic pressures, forces that could reshape what comes next. One issue that Russia has raised is transit and treaty obligations. Lithuania's existing gas transit contract with Gazprom for Kaliningrad is due to expire in late 2025. Russian officials have suggested that cutting or altering transit could violate previous agreements or require compensation. Meanwhile, Lithuanian leaders, including the president, have warned against doing anything that provokes Russia unnecessarily. They've argued that maintaining the movement of goods and people and natural gas could avoid deeper conflict. This comes packed with concerns about retaliation. Experts say Russia may respond not just with military posturing, but with hybrid tactics. This includes cyber attacks on infrastructure, sabotage, or more legal complaints at international bodies. Since the Baltic states anticipated disruption when they left the Russian grid, they boosted security around critical points. These included places like transformer stations, inverter links, and transmission lines. That preparation shows the stakes are not only about blackouts, but about how the law, diplomacy, and covert action may play out in the coming months. Later on in the video, we'll dive into some of this, so hang tight. For now, you might be wondering why such a fuss is being made over an area that is not even part of mainland Russia. Well, the biggest factor that makes this place an area of interest is that it isn't just a civilian region. It's a military stronghold, designed to remind Europe that Moscow is right next door. Warships patrol from Baltijsk, submarines lurk beneath the Baltic, and missile launchers sit within striking distance of the capitals of Poland and the Baltics. Then they have a wide assortment of air defenses and tens of thousands of troops that are ready to provoke Europe at any time. However, all the equipment, especially their radar stations, requires a lot of power every single day. That's why when the June sabotage interrupted power, it was a big deal. Even the submarine drills they had planned were interrupted. It showed just how much even a short power cut could rattle the base. Now, even if the main plants were to fail, Kaliningrad's greatest strength could flip into a weakness. Simply put, this isn't a place that can afford to lose power. And yet, that is what has happened. This realization is why, after Lithuania cut the power lines to Kaliningrad, the fallout went far beyond electricity. For starters, NATO quickly realized that energy infrastructure, once seen as a civilian concern, had become a key vulnerability. What used to be boring engineering equipment can now be seen as a target in modern warfare and political games. That's why cyber teams that once only trained on Ukraine's hacked grid began running drills across the Baltics to protect energy infrastructure. This year, they even staged a fake blackout in Riga to test how cities would cope. The test found weak spots, and upgrades followed quickly. Estonia went even further by training soldiers with utility workers. Soldiers practiced guarding remote wind farms, while engineers learned how to reroute power lines if they were cut. The lesson was simple. In modern war, blackouts can be just as dangerous as a missile strike. On their own side, Moscow has not been taking this disconnection to Kaliningrad quietly. After all, their heavily militarized zone has just been exposed. When this happened, Russian officials quickly condemned Lithuania's action. They're calling it a provocative act of economic warfare meant to isolate Kaliningrad and test Russia's strength. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called it an unfriendly escalation and compared it to NATO trying to surround Russia. He promised that Russia would respond to protect its interests. Behind the scenes, the Kremlin also increased military activity in the area. Satellite images from early September showed new deployments of Iskander missile systems along Kaliningrad's border. These mobile launchers, which can carry nuclear warheads, were placed near the Lithuanian border and the Suwalki Gap, the narrow strip that connects Kaliningrad to Belarus. Analysts said this was the strongest show of force since the February grid switch. But beyond the tough talk and the military moves, the cutoff hits Russia where it hurts the most, strategically. From Moscow's view, this isolation strikes at the heart of Kaliningrad's role as a key military outpost. The region isn't just a piece of land on the map. It's a forward base that lets Russia keep an eye on NATO's eastern edge. With missiles that can reach deep into Europe and a naval fleet that controls parts of the Baltic Sea, losing the power connection means Moscow has one less way to pressure the Baltics, like it used to with energy threats. Now, any glitch in Kaliningrad's own system could expose those bases to blackouts. That makes it harder to run radars, launch operations, or to even fuel submarines. This sends a signal of weakness to the West, showing that Russia's grip on its exclave is more fragile than before. Putin sees it as a direct challenge because if Kaliningrad falters, it could invite NATO to test the borders, especially along the Suwalki Gap. In short, the cutoff turns a strength into a potential headache, forcing Moscow to pour more resources into defending and supplying an area that's now even more cut off from the mainland. The strategic pinch isn't the only problem. For the people living in Kaliningrad, the cutoff is hitting their daily lives hard. To begin with, sanctions make the situation tougher. The EU has imposed over 2,500 restrictions, the US more than 3,100, targeting everything from energy to spare parts. Getting equipment for power plants now costs 40% more, and some suppliers refuse to sell to Russia at all. Between that and the cutoff, electricity prices in Kaliningrad jumped 12% this year, reaching 8 rubles per kilowatt hour, double the mainland average. For a family of 4, that means power bills of about 5,000 rubles a month. That's a big hit when wages average 45,000 rubles and pensions are just 20,000. Many residents have now been forced to cut back, turning to wood stoves for heat. Even supermarkets sometimes face empty shelves because deliveries by ship or plane are slowed by border checks and sanctions. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But coming back to the Kaliningrad citizens, the mood on the ground isn't really easy to pin down. Some residents express quiet frustration, not just over rising bills, but over feeling like pawns in a political game that they didn't choose. Among younger locals, there's growing resentment towards Moscow's choices. Many see their future slipping away in power cuts and sanctions. But others, especially older generations or those tied to the military, remain fiercely loyal to the Kremlin, brushing off the hardships as the cost of standing up to the West. A lot of people seem stuck somewhere in between tired and worried, but unsure where to place the blame. It's not a full-on protest mood, but more of a slow simmer. YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone should start a channel, but if you've ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel or a faceless channel, now's kind of the perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions every day, and it's pushing newer, smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure you have many questions on how to get started and grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. And that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one YouTube video for completely free. So, if you are someone who's interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can watch that video here on YouTube by clicking on the link in the description or the card on your screen. At the same time, Russia is looking beyond its borders for lifelines to address this messy situation. China has become one of the main support routes for Russia, as those sanctions squeeze across every sector. Even with Western limits, Chinese firms still buy Russian energy, equipment, or raw materials. Beijing's Ministry of Commerce has clearly stated its opposition to unilateral energy sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction. This means it aims to keep trading with Russia under the idea of mutual benefit, equality, and respect. This doesn't erase the pressure, but it gives Russia a partial buffer. That said, using outside help comes with its own delays and risks. Importing tech through indirect networks, avoiding firms that are sanctioned, paying higher transport costs, all add to the fragility already exposed by electricity cuts. In Kaliningrad's case, even if China or similar partners step in, it may not fix sudden outages or the high cost of the diesel backup, or solve shortages in critical spare parts fast enough. All in all, it just isn't a good time for the area as the problems keep piling up. The local economy is struggling, with GDP down 5% in 2024 and trade with the EU slashed by 70%. We'll talk about that just now. But the basic truth is that Kaliningrad has had far better times, and the fragility of its systems is in full view right now. The power cutoff didn't just push up the bills. It hit Kaliningrad's key industries where it hurts the most. What was once a bustling export hub is now scraping by on rerouted supplies and dimmer prospects. Take the amber trade, for example. Long considered Kaliningrad's golden lifeline, it was among the first to feel the impact. The Yantarny mine is one of the largest amber mines in the world, and the main source of amber for Russia. It is so large that it produces roughly 40% of global amber production. But since the grid cut off, power fluctuations have stalled conveyor belts and polishing machines. Local reports suggest output dropped 18% in the first half of 2025, coinciding with the disconnection. Workers from the mine describe frequent stops during voltage drops, forcing hand sorting that slows production and drives up costs. Shipments to Europe, once trucked through Lithuania, now detour by sea. This has resulted in delivery time stretching by weeks and logistics costs rising by 15%. Buyers in Poland and Germany are quietly shifting to Baltic suppliers. And it's not just mining either. Tourism has also declined. Before the war, Kaliningrad's beaches and Prussian castles drew over 1 million visitors each year. This summer, numbers reportedly fell below 400,000. This is attributed to blackouts shutting down hotel air conditioning. And as you might expect from tourists expecting comfortable stays, complaints flooded social media. Even the Karanian Spit, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, saw foot traffic drop by 30%. Tour operators point to unreliable ferries and lighthouses going dark at dusk. This is hurting the local economy big time. Even the fishing fleets out of Svetli are struggling to stay afloat. Diesel backups burn fuel at triple the mainland rate, and outages force captains to dock early to avoid spoilage. August catches fell by 22%, and onshore processors running on unstable power report spoilage rates up 12%. These figures reflect more than economic strain. They represent families in Zelenogradsk watching factories lay off workers, and amber carvers in Svitlogorsk turning to bootleg vodka sales just to make rent. In response, Moscow pledged 5 billion rubles in subsidies for what it calls island resilience. Ferry runs from St. Petersburg were expanded, adding 3 weekly trips. Yet transport costs remain 40% higher than before, and winter storms threaten to choke supply lines further. Each flicker of the lights now feels like a warning, a reminder how one severed cable can ripple through an entire region. Europe's broader energy shift puts Kaliningrad's struggles into sharper context. In 2021, Russia supplied 40% of the EU's gas, worth 55 billion euros. By 2024, that share had dropped to just 11%, as Europe turned to alternative sources. Now, in 2025, it is even lower. The Baltics have fully disconnected from their former supplier, and the rest of Europe continues to phase out Russian energy. Liquefied natural gas from Qatar and the United States has filled the gap, with Germany's new terminals handling 70 billion cubic meters annually. Oil imports from Russia have fallen by 90%, coal by 97%. The EU's REPowerEU plan has invested 300 billion euros into alternatives, including wind farms, solar fields, and hydrogen hubs. Wind power now meets a quarter of Europe's demand. generating 250 terawatt-hours a year. Belgium brought nuclear power plants back online to stabilize supply. Germany built hydrogen hubs to store clean energy. Prices that spiked during the 2022 crisis have now settled at 35 euros per megawatt-hour, half of their peak. For European households, this has brought relief. For Moscow, it has meant losing one of its most potent tools for influence. This energy shift isn't just about politics or prices. It's also about the planet, and the Baltics are leading the way. The Baltics have ramped up their use of wind and solar, jumping from about 45% renewables in recent years to aiming for 92% soon. This means less dirty fuel and more power from the sun and wind, cutting carbon emissions by around 15% since the grid change. Latvia's wind farms alone output 1.5 terawatt-hours a year, while Estonia's solar setups add another 1.2 terawatt-hours, powering homes and businesses without the heavy pollution. On the other side, Kaliningrad sticks with old coal plants that run at low efficiency, spewing out smoke and relying on fuel shipped from far away. Those plants burn through resources at a high rate, adding to air quality problems that affect local health and the environment. Europe's push for green energy, with investments like 300 billion euros in the REPowerEU plan, shows a clear divide. The Baltics are building a future that is not only secure, but also easier on the planet, while Kaliningrad's setup keeps it tied to outdated, dirtier ways that could cost more in the long run. This greener path has sparked more than just cleaner air in the Baltics. It's fueled a sense of pride across the region. This is not a metaphor. In the Baltics, the grid cutoff sparked an actual wave of pride. For people in Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn, it felt like a second independence. News outlets called it a historic turning point. Schools began teaching it as a part of the national story. Families who remembered Soviet times, when local languages were banned and churches were shut down, saw it as a way to finally close that chapter. Leaders framed the switch as a triumph of planning and unity, proof that small nations could outmaneuver a giant. On the streets, ordinary people shared stories of relief, knowing their lights and their heat were now tied to Europe, not Moscow. Some even held quiet gatherings, toasting to a future free from Russian control. Kaliningrad was once designed to intimidate NATO and remind Europe of Russia's reach. Today, it demands constant support and sits exposed to pressure from every direction. Any serious disruption to its gas pipeline, supply routes, or electric grid could cripple its ability to function. Russia has considered building a nuclear power plant to reduce dependence on mainland supply, but progress has stalled. Environmental concerns, cost overruns, and international scrutiny have delayed construction. Military analysts are now asking a harder question. If the region cannot be reliably powered, can it be reliably defended? A blackout during a crisis could neutralize radar systems, disable command centers, or ground aircraft. For a country that built Kaliningrad to project strength, the risk of losing it or watching it unravel from within could send the opposite message. What stands out most is the symbolism. For the Baltics, cutting the lines to Kaliningrad was about more than electricity. It was about breaking free from a painful past. From 1940 to 1991, Soviet rule brought hardship. In 1949 alone, Operation Priboy deported 95,000 people, including 43,000 from Latvia, 20,000 from Estonia, and 32,000 from Lithuania. Families were torn apart and sent to labor camps in Siberia. Many never returned. Local languages were suppressed. Churches closed and national symbols banned. When the Baltics won independence in 1991, the Brel grid remained a lingering tie to Moscow, a reminder of control they had not fully escaped. Severing it in 2025 showed that these three small nations, with just 6 million people, could stand up to Russia's 144 million and choose their own path. They did it not with soldiers, but with engineers and cables, proving that a power shift can come without a single shot. For Kaliningrad, the question is no longer just about electricity. It is about what happens when the walls of the fortress begin to close in. Once a symbol of Russia's reach into Europe, the region now feels more like a stranded outpost. Its power lines cut, its options narrowing, its future uncertain. Just across the border, the Baltic states have chosen a different path. They rewired their countries not only physically, but also politically, moving away from coercion and towards cooperation. They have shown that strength is not measured only in missiles or megawatts, but in the ability to stand alone, connect with allies, and weather the storm without blinking. At the end of the day, when the cables to Kaliningrad were finally cut, it was not just an energy shift. It was a quiet revolution, a moment when three small nations chose sovereignty over fear and lit their way forward with their own hands.